So I'm going to look at persuasion and the ideology of the separate spheres. And first of all, I'll just outline what the ideology of the separate spheres is. So it was an idea whereby women were put in a domestic role, so they would run the household and life behind the scenes, and men were very much in the public sphere, dealing with things such as political matters, economic issues, and legal concerns. Men did represent their families in the public domain, and in a patriarchal society in the 19th century, it was quite obvious why, because men were considered to be more in power and women were often behind the scenes. This ideology did govern women and meant that many women did have very restrictive lives, and using this ideology I'm going to look at its influence over aspects of persuasion, looking particularly at the ways in which characters within persuasion adhere to and defy the ideology of separate spheres and what this represents. So, in Persuasion, Anne, at the very start of the novel, is described as being only Anne to her family. She has no status or apparent value to her relatives. She is not married into wealth, and she has, as Austen writes, lost her bloom or beauty, and to a very superficial father like Walter Elliot, he completely dismisses her from his high regard. What's interesting about this is that whilst the Elliot family do not think Anne to be of importance, Jane Austen clearly does. Austen's narrative praises Anne time and again, and she is, after all, the central character. Linking Anne's lack of value to the idea of separate spheres creates an interesting satirical view of women in the 19th century. Women were often judged by how they performed within the so-called appropriate sphere. Because Anne has yet to perform within it, she's not married at the age of 27, being practically a spinster in those days. She does not run a household of her own or have children. She has, in a sense, failed within the sphere in which many women believed it was her duty to belong within at the start of the novel. As a result, she was therefore of little consequence to her family. But Austen goes against this notion in a sense. She sees Anne's value in her good character. She describes Anne as having an elegance of mind and sweetness of character, which must place her high with people of real understanding. So here she's suggesting to the reader that we should regard her highly, even if her family doesn't. Austen could then be saying that women should not be judged solely on their domestic achievements, but on their good character, on the ways in which they conduct themselves, and how they treat those around them. Okay. Marion Reed writes about the women's sphere in A Plea for Women in 1843. And while she sees some merit in women being in the domestic sphere, as she writes here, although we are convinced that no elevation of the domestic position of women can ever withdraw domestic occupations and pleasures from forming a part, and perhaps even the chief part of her sphere, yet we are quite unable to see either the right or the reason which confines her to those occupations and pleasures. So here she's saying that women do have strength in domestic roles, but that it shouldn't confine them or define them either. She also claims that women during the 19th century had very little choice. Either they marry well and depend on their husbands, work for their own means, often earning very little and living poorly, or eventually fall to ruin. Therefore, it made it very difficult for women to break out of this sphere when they had little or no alternatives. However, Sophia Croft in Persuasion is married to Admiral Croft. She is a figure who goes against convention and steps out of the women's sphere. Mrs. Croft has a discussion with her brother Frederick Wentworth about ladies being aboard a ship. As she is married to an admiral, and she has lived on a ship, and this both breaks and adheres to the ideology of the separate spheres. She is still with her husband, there to look after him and fulfill her role as a wife on the one hand, but she is not in a domestic setting. She is on a ship, merging into the professional world of her seafaring husband. Unusually too, she is vastly well-travelled and has visited many places with her husband, and this illustrates how she has quite dramatically managed to break away from being stuck behind closed doors, purely fulfilling a domestic role. She is actually exploring the world beside her husband. She tells of her 15 years of marriage and how she has been once to the East Indies, being in different places about the home, such as Cork and Lisbon and Gibraltar. Wentworth rebukes the statements by saying that women and children have no right to be comfortable on board, which kind of agrees with the notion that women and children belong in a domestic world separated from his professional world. But Mrs. Croft's response again breaks this ideology. She says, "I hate to hear you talking as if women were all fine ladies instead of rational creatures. We none of us expect to be in smooth waters all our days." Austen could be saying here that women are just as capable as men. they can handle being in the professional environment, even if this idea is slightly less prominent because of the fact that Mrs. Croft is in the professional environment purely to be with her husband. However, there is a prevailing sense that she is beside her husband for love more than duty, which is the new way of looking at marriage. It's more about companionship and being with her husband because she wants to, not because she has to. The ideology was reflected in many paintings in the Victorian era, and George Elgar Hicks illustrates it in his paintings several times, and there's one before you as well. Here we see the sinews of Old England painted in 1857. The man is the central aspect of the painting, standing proud, his pickaxe representing the idea that he is the breadwinner of the family and provides the support the family needs. His wife leans on him, looking up to him with such admiration, hinting at the idea that she is reliant on him and he is the central aspect of her life. The idyllic setting with a touch of domesticity we see in the background with glimpse of the kitchen and the child clinging to her father all highlights the ideology of separate spheres of men and women. And it also suggests that by adhering to these spheres, it will result in a happy and contented life, which we can see kind of reflected in this painting here. It's very idyllic. However, this does not seem to be the case when looking at Anne's deceased mother, Lady Elliot, at the beginning of the novel. It's clear that she has put her husband before herself and is not entirely happy with having to cover up her husband's mistakes. We are introduced to Lady Elliot as being an excellent woman, sensible and amiable, whose judgment and conduct, if they might be pardoned the youthful infatuation which made her Lady Elliot, had never required indulgence afterwards. Austen's narrative does suggest that Lady Elliot's character far exceeds that of her husband, Walter, which elevates her against her husband, and it's quite contrary to the day where women were often seen as lesser to their husbands and there to serve their husbands. Austen goes on to write that she had humoured or softened or concealed his failings and promoted his respectability for 17 years, and though not the happiest being in the world herself, had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach to her life. Although it does seem that Lady Elliot has found enough contentment and happiness through her so-called duties, there is still a sense of unfulfillment, and this links back to the idea Marion Reed has put across in What's a Woman to Do. Marion Reed argues that why should women have to be happy with their lot just because society dictates that they should be confined to this certain role? And she believes that it's only there and enforced on women because it has been done since time immemorial, when we should really try and break away from this. So it appears that the ideology is present within persuasion and can alter the ways in which characters are treated and viewed. But Austen seems to be hinting at the idea of going further than what convention expects of women. Mrs. Croft is an example of a woman who has broken away from the sphere and has lived unconventionally because of her marriage of love. Whilst Anne is regarded as of less importance from her family for her age, looks and unmarried status, she is regarded by her creator and many characters in the novel as being the best of all. Even if upon her first meeting the character Van, she has not yet taken on the role of wife or mother, she is central and highly regarded by Austen's narrative. However, in the end, Anne does adhere to the ideology in a sense because her goal has always been to make a good match in marriage. Any questions? Got my book on a piece of paper for you.
Can we talk about Austen's, I thought it was really kind of thought-provoking talk, but that there, they're not the very happiest being in the world herself.
Yeah.
What do you think the tone of that is? What do you think that means?
I think it's hinting at the fact that there's a sense of unfulfillment, that she may have been happy to do what she felt she should do in society, but there's a sense that she kind of wanted to go further than that. And I think Austen hints at it time and again, especially with Mrs. Croft and Admiral Croft, that there's a sense that women shouldn't be so confined and restricted, and especially because Lady Elliot, I think, is made to seem better than her husband. She's got a better state of mind, and her husband's quite frivolous and superficial, Walter Elliot, that I think she's hinting a lot at the mismatch of the pair.
It's that kind of Austenian irony, isn't it? I mean, is that litotes? You know, that's the rhetorical form where you say something by saying, well, it's not. So if I say, Wordsworth starts a poem where he says, not useless do I deem. In other words, these things are useful. So is that litotes? Is she saying that actually she's unhappy? Not by contradicting the very happiest being?
Yeah, I would say so. I think it's interesting because it seems like a very subtle way of putting it, but I think she is saying that, because I think she's just saying that Lady Elliot is unfulfilled. That's what I got from the reading of that anyway.